What strikes you about the video, the Caribou Skin Lodge? It's a ton of work. That's quite a few hides too, it seems to me at least. I'm not a caribou hunting person, but it seems like that's a lot of hides. Obviously, these things do last, but they probably need more hides over time. And who has to do all that work, by the way? It is primarily focused on women, and the women are the ones that have to do all that scraping and curing and washing and squeezing and sewing, especially to get this thing going. Building a single family house is a lot of work too. Yeah, it is true. So we should keep that in mind. So this is a lot of work. Building a house is a lot of work. Housing is hard. I find it interesting that these things basically disappeared in the 1920s, and people started using canvas tents for a while, and then they just didn't make them at all. And I hadn't looked at it until some guy just bought one, took it to the University of Iowa. I'm sure those old people knew what they were doing, but there had to be a lot of revival of skill too. Nobody had made one of these for 80 years. And so they brought this one back, probably looked at that a little bit before they started trying to make a couple more. And now, well, now they got a couple. It's also interesting that Ingold is an anthropologist. He was studying in the circumpolar north, and as anthropologists do, we often go to these places when we want to see what things might have been like. But in this case, and in many cases, those things have just completely disappeared. And so Ingold goes back, his experience where he's kneeling down in the middle of a conical lodge and looking up at the thing is like outside of some anthropology conference in a museum where he has this revelation. So like I said, I dug into the end notes to find out these words are actually, I looked at somebody teaching me how to pronounce these words on TikTok or Facebook or somewhere, and they're completely unpronounceable for English speakers. But if you go, you can find somebody to teach you how to pronounce that. But as they said in the video, there's a connection between the dog rib peoples, and there's various divisions of these. But this is their contemporary flag, and there you can see the conical lodge hitting in there. So Ingold goes in and kneels down on the clammy ground and looks up, and I'm just completely struck by this episode. He has a moment of revelation, kneeling down on that clammy ground, that we inhabit a world of earth and sky. There it is. You had to go into almost a museum-like setting to have this revelation. It actually didn't happen in the field. It happened outside of the museum where we had put up a caribou skin conical lodge for people to have this revelation in. So then he goes on to say that it's a very different world than the world of landscape and architecture, the world of hard floors, ceilings, and windows. And he says if we have an apartment, you look out and you see the earth skyline in the distance. So that's what we have. We have places where we can see the earth skyline. So I asked you about the classroom. We can't see the earth skyline from here. Can we? I've sometimes insisted that I can't teach this class and I can't teach Ingold in a windowless classroom. So I've gone and I've gotten a classroom with windows. Yeah, no, it's weird how weird our classrooms are. But when I was thinking about it and I made you guys reflect on the classroom and then you could look off into the horizon, I thought, I don't know if that's actually any better, because that's just the modern looking out at the horizon. It doesn't really give you the world, the earth sky world that Ingold wants, because in the lodge, you actually can't see the horizon. You got those caribou skins covering you. You don't see the horizon, Ingold says. That's a modern thing, to be able to look out from in from the window onto the horizon. Instead, you have the earth sky, which are unified at the very center of my emplaced building. So there it is, the revelation. I don't know if you can have this revelation in a classroom. Windows are not. Very difficult. So, the earth sky. Now, this brings up a question. I've been circling this question since the beginning of the class because it has to do with the history of anthropological thought. But I have this strange hope that today it's going to hit. It's going to hit harder than it's hit before, and we'll finally figure out what Ingold is talking about. So here's the question. Who has architecture? Or does everyone have architecture? How would we have answered this question for the last few hundred years, or 100 years ago, if I said, who has architecture? We would not count the stupid conical lodge. That's just a bunch of hides getting sewn on to a bunch of poles. What we want is, or the elite Western perspective is, that only I have architecture. And in fact, I use that I very deliberately because architecture, as Ingold tells us, and this is still true today, when we look at architecture, we think about the great architects. And so, as Ingold tells us, that architecture has, for the past few hundred years or so, been very, very elite-centered, and in fact, very singular genius-centered. Might even be able to name some architects. You think of the architect as this guy sitting around having this genius idea, and then they realize that design in their building. And for Ingold, it's in line or in tandem with this idea. You have the building in a landscape. So the landscape becomes the stage for a building. So it's the place where the building is, but it's also the scenery for that building to make it look cool. And so for the architect to have architecture, and that's why that nature guy doesn't count, is that the buildings are supposed to stand on the land. They're on the land. Boom. A monument to human achievement, not some goofy earth house. So the anthropologist comes in and says, "You're being ethnocentric. You're being arrogant, you Westerners. In fact, everybody has architecture. We see it as it's just part of culture. It's part of learned behavior. Stop being an ethnocentric ass." So, yeah, it's not like somebody comes up and says, "I have an idea for the conical lodge." It's not the individual genius. What anthropologists would say, it's the cultural tradition. It's what you learn and pass on, and people make choices partially based on their environment, but it doesn't have to be that way. You can do all kinds of things on there. And in fact, in the film, they said that they lived in different kinds of structures. That might have been the most common, but it wasn't the only one. And it may change over time. But the point of the matter is we would say that this is the peculiar human genius. It's maybe not an individual genius, and even those individual geniuses should recognize their debt to all of humanity as they do their designs. But what is amazing about human beings is we just don't go live in little goofy nests and earth and shit. We go put our designs on the land, and so we make things so we can seal off ourselves and put these little things on the land. And so the conical lodge would be an example of that, because there you have it. A cone on the land. Boom, architecture. Screw you, Westerners. We're coming in with anthropology. And that's why that woman, that great anthropologist, had to get that conical lodge back, the Caribou Lodge back from the University of Iowa, and give it back to them so they could make some more. Now, Ingold says that the problem with this is, in our effort to be not ethnocentric, and again, I don't want to go back to ethnocentrism. I don't want to do that. Sometimes you need to say, no, everybody does have architecture, you fool. But in our effort to not be ethnocentric, we sometimes project, or we incorporate our ideas about what architecture is onto other societies. And so now we're saying that all societies have design on land, or all societies have what is, say, human over nature or cone on landscape. And we're in some ways projecting that onto what they're doing. Ingold is trying to actually get us to rethink the whole notion of what architecture is or what building is. And he says that what we should think instead of design on land, let me put a couple things. So instead of thinking that we are projecting a form onto matter or putting a design onto the land, what in his words it will be is binding together materials in movement or a process. And so he writes that I want to propose an alternative view of building. The lodge, in this view, far from being erected upon rigid and impervious foundations, is stitched into the very fabric of the earth. And then he tells us that this is going to be a 5-step argument. There's a nice little outline of all 5 steps there, which we'll go through in order. But in fact, if we just read the 5 steps there, they might be easier to do like this. 5 steps. First step, I consider the materiality of earth and sky and what it means to say of the lodge that it is both of the earth and of the sky. So we don't have just projected onto the land, we have both earth and sky. Second step, connect the idea of the earth sky to that of smooth space. Okay. And show how the connection is manifested in the covering materials of the lodge. All right, that'll be step 2. That's actually one of my hardest steps. In step 3, I contrast the accord of earth and sky in the conical lodge with their discord in the life and dwelling of the peasant farmer by drawing a comparison with the mariner's relation to the ocean. That one is cool. In the 4th step, I show how the idea of landscape in its modern guise entails a transition from the gathering of experiences to their projection, or from a haptic to an optical mode of perception. Finally, I explain the conical form of the lodge as an upended vortex, the envelope of vital spiral of growth and regeneration. What the heck was he talking about? That's me. That's the hearth, actually. I actually think it is worth pausing. So what, just to go with this 5th step for a second, instead of thinking about cones on the landscape, actually, let's go back to that flag for a second. I just want to show you. Instead of thinking about cones on the landscape, that would be cones on the landscape. We're going to be thinking about these as vortex swirls coming up and the fire coming out like smoke swirling around. All right, so it's a 5-step argument. But before we have to deal with the 4 elements that come from some German guy we've never heard of, Simper, and his 4 elements of architecture and other writings. Which are actually cool. I don't think Ingold is totally down on Spencer. He gets a lot out of Semper. Obviously, we have the hearth and the fire at the center of the building is not something that we would think about in today's world. So he is thinking, this Semper guy is more thinking about these traditional architectural forms. Ingold says here that he spends the most time, or Semper does, on this contrast between the earthwork, what you have to do for the foundation and making stones and the kinds of stuff that you build things on, and the idea of a framework, which is what the carpenters do with their beams and put things into a place, and it creates the fundamental paradox or contrast of the building itself, is how it is in some ways the foundation done by the stone people and the earth and the brick people, and then this framework done by the carpentry people. Then we'll deal with the membrane and the hearth or the fire at the center. So I just want to put that out there because he's dealing with, so this guy was in 1853 or something. 1851. Wow, I almost nailed it. The 4 elements of architecture. So he's in some ways arguing, not necessarily against this, but showing us how the conical lodge is different from this. So the first question is the conical lodge an object on the earth? He's going to say it's not an object on top of the earth, which is how we usually think of buildings. We usually think of buildings as you got your earth and then plunk, 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 like Monopoly houses or something. You can't deny that's how we think of them. That's how we think of our buildings, our houses. We think plunk, gonna build a house. Boom. In fact, sometimes when I'm driving on 88, I see one of these houses driving down the road. I have to drive. You ever have to drive around a house that's being driven down the road? It's crazy. Actually, this is even worse than Ingold said now. Now we have houses that are being transported from place to place, and then you just go plunk, and you got your house. Ingold is going to say no, but how should we look at it? Is the lodge an object on the earth? We know it's not in the sky. It's going into the sky. It's reaching for the sky. It's in both. What is something that is in the earth and yet is reaching for the sky? A tree, thank you. What, it was too much. You couldn't just say it. It's more like a tree. It's rooted in the ground, reaching to the sky. It's not on the ground. You wouldn't say that a tree is on the ground. It's in the ground. It's coming from the ground, growing up toward the sky. Liv said that we should think of our houses, our wooden houses, more like different forms of trees. Entirely would be a cool thing to do. And Ingold in other places thinks about that, but now he's too fixated on this lodge. So for Ingold, the lodge, the ground of the lodge is where you gather up your nourishment, because it's still the ground. You actually haven't, you're still on the ground. That's why you can kneel down on the ground. Those lodges in the video look like they're on a parking lot, and they unify the earth and the sky. So the lodge is where the earth and the sky do come together. It's not the object on the earth. All right, so that's the first point, is it's quite different from your traditional idea of objects being placed on the earth, or in the case of Semper, who he is. In the case of Semper, the idea of the earthenworks and the foundation and the carpentry on top. Now, then he goes to step two, which is oftentimes our buildings are meant to close us off from the elements. That's why somebody wants to go to places where it's not coming in the cold, because you're supposed to close off from the cold and close off from the world around you. And so the second part is that whether the lodge is meant to close off. And indeed, this is where he introduces the notion of the smooth space, which is what we're supposed to be happy with. Smooth space makes us happy, striated space makes us sad. But I will have to say, this is where he starts talking about two guys that drive me a little bit nuts. Deleuze and Guattari. Anybody ever seen these guys before? They're very popular back in the 1970s and 1980s. And yes, this is perhaps their most famous book, 1,000 Plateaus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. I forget what the argument of this book is. It might be that capitalism is itself schizophrenic, which is, you can't argue with that either, can you? I don't think you can. They are philosophers and psychoanalysts, and generally very interesting in the world of ideas, but very French and hard to understand. And Ingold plays around with them and plays footsie with them throughout the book. But whenever they come up, I shudder, because you're sure that they're going to draw on some weird example, but then it's not quite going to make sense. And so Ingold will be liking it, but then not liking it. I think that I agree with you. The beautiful thing about Deleuze and Guattari is when they're all off getting high and thinking about, like, oh, felt, man, felt, the smooth world of felt, and that's what the nomads have, is felt, and they have felt tents, and they're all in their felt, and they get way into the felt. And Ingold is like, okay, I like that idea, guys, but not everybody has felt. Actually, that's Ingold's point. It's like, there's all kinds of nomads who don't do felt. So then he goes along, but he solves the whole issue by saying, well, fine, But we have animal hides here, so screw all you guys, because we're doing caribou skins. I don't know if he knew how many caribou hides it would take to do that, but what he calls this is what that means is for the tent, for the conical lodge, you get like the advantages of both worlds. You get the Deleuze and Guattari idea of the smooth, you get the felt, but it's also stitched together by those poor women who have to. Ingold does mention the skills of the seamstress to stitch all that patchwork together. So you get the wonderful advantages of the patchwork in this world of the smooth world, but you do it with animal hides, not with felt. Take that, Deleuze and Guattari. So the nomads and the felt nomads and the animal skins are all part of this smooth world. But he also talks about, well, how does that compare with the peasants? Do we like these guys? I think so. Yeah, Ingold is down on the peasants here. I was sad. He was like, man, these farmers. He says they're always battling the land. It sounds like they're losing half the time too. It's like, man. So I did my field work with small farmers. I feel like this might be a little bit unfair to them. He's being a little bit harsh on the farmers, but he does have a little bit of a point. He's not trying to be mean to the farmers. He knows the farmers are working hard too. But he says that it is true that in the peasant dwellings, the dwelling of the small farmer, it has the earth and the sky, but he says it's more like earth with a line between it and the sky. So it's there, but it's not the best. Not like the earth sky, like he wants to have it. It's still battling the earth and making marks on it and trying to fight it all the time. So what do we want to be like instead? Like the other two. Yeah, we definitely don't want to be farmers. Don't get me wrong. In my other class, I just tried to convince them to be farmers. But in this class, we are not going to be farmers. What do we want to be? Nomads and mariners. That's right. We don't want to be battling the earth. We want to be riding the earth, man. As mariners ride the waves, nomads ride the pastures, roaming the wind-swept expanses of steppe, sand, and snow, and responding in their movements to both celestial and subterranean forces. To be fair, I don't know if we want to be fair, especially when he's beating up the farmers, but he's drawing on the ideas that they had. This is on the top of 161, is why the Vikings, who knew a thing or two about both farming and sailing. So that's what he's saying. He's saying they knew a thing or two. He didn't say they spent their life on the sea. Would readily compare their ocean-going long ships to horses, but only rarely to plows. So he's saying the Vikings knew about farming, and if they were talking about going on the ocean, they would compare their ships to horses, but they don't compare them to plowing the land because that's fighting the earth. They could ride the waves, but could not carve their furrows. Anyway, don't get too hung up on it. I started thinking about this though in my earth sky thing and the farmers. Now I'm not sure if this is too farmer for Ingold, but the Ukrainian flag, when there's an artistic representation of it, which is supposed to be the wheat in the sky. That's the yellow and the blue. To me, this is earth sky too. It might be a little too much like peasant, too much farmer, but there's something to be learned from this. I like this flag. All right, we're at step 4. Step 4 of the 5-step process. This one is titled From Gathering to Projection. What is going on here? Ah, yes. Ingold says that as we move from the tents to the house, what's the first thing we do with those walls? As the tent is replaced by the wall of the house, what do we do with our walls? Huh? So first you put the carpets on the walls. Now you put your carpets on the floor. This is the most fun I've had in years. What's abstract about that? Carpets on the floor. There's nothing abstract. Carpets on the walls, now carpets on the floors. But yes, it does immediately get abstract because it says that takes us from the haptic, the touch of engagement to the optical, which is to say that we have moved from close engagement, trying to weave things, make little things and tapestries, to observing. I think that's why Ingold is saying that we have to have carpets on floors, because that makes them more like the ground, because you can actually deal with it. It makes it more human-like. Carpets are, Ingold says, that they beg to be carpeted, the hard floors. And it parallels his whole argument with the idea of the screen. It used to be the woven fabric that the screen was a tent wall. That would be considered the screen or the veil. And so, as opposed to now, we have woven fabric versus projection surface, the idea between gathering experience versus displaying images, and tent wall versus cinema screen, which makes me wonder, look at how much work that took me. I had to do that all out in human time, not just project words up onto the screen that flash at you. I was living it out, smelling the chalk. It was in my hands and on my clothes. Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I do worry that I betrayed Ingold by making teaching into projection, but I just never liked the feel. Chalk. So that brings us to the hearth, the fire. Ingold tells us that among the indigenous peoples of the circumpolar north, that's where we are, the fire of the hearth is universally venerated. And he says it's partially because of its light and its heat. Those are good things to have, especially in the circumpolar north, but as the generative source of life itself. In fact, fire is alive. It's its own thing that is clothed by the conical lodge. And so, to get to our end point, conical lodge isn't just a cone on a geometric plane. It's not an object that we plop there. It is the envelope of an upward spiral, an upended vortex with the hearth as its eye and the knotted tent poles at its tip. That would have taken me like 45 minutes just to write that out on the chalkboard. But there you go. It's all projected into you. So now you've learned more. Now, so let's go back to our lodge versus the monument. Where do the academic buildings fit in? Why are our classrooms the way they are? They're pretty solidly in monument land. Our whole colleges are designed almost to be monuments. And so, in fact, the college, or Ingold says, whereas the monument was built once and for all, the lodge is always building and rebuilding. So you always have to be stitching together new caribou hides and sewing them on and doing that stuff. But in the world of the classroom, in the world of academia, we're supposed to be doing things that endure for all time. We're supposed to be in monument land. How's that working out? So, yeah, I feel like everything's coming apart. We've made it a good 20 or 30 years in this classroom, but I don't know when it's just going to crumble to the ground. Sometimes, well, this prefigures what we'll read about for next time, but sometimes I'm walking up to the Hartwick and if it's been raining or something, I just wonder if it's all going to slide down. You know, ever wonder that if it's all just going to mudslide? So Ingold says here that for us inhabitants, it is the architectural monument that seems ephemeral. So he says that the typical perspective is that the lodge is ephemeral and the monument lasts forever. But for the inhabitant, for people who are actually living their life, the monument is ephemeral, buried in the sands of time while life goes on. As writing eventually fades, so also in time, the monument, the Hartwick, though designed to last in perpetuity, cracks and crumbles. There it goes. So I got really into this, obviously. Got really into the Conical Lodge. I was just struck by two separate emotions, and I want to know about you. What do you think? Would you like to live in a conical lodge? Are you convinced? Binding and unbinding the hearth of fire, the ground, the air. We need boat houses. Oh, that is great. It's great because, in fact, in the next chapter, the title of the chapter is, What if the city was an ocean and it's building ships? So you're right onto it. You're there, you're halfway there already. Yeah, for me, I was really into this conical lodge, but I was just like, ugh, it just sounded so cold and hard, and I wanted just to know where I would take a shower. It's not an easy life, but as Jonathan says, it's also hard to build a house. Those things are hard too. I don't like maintaining my house either, and that sucks. So I don't know. There is something about it. It is interesting, like I said, that, well, I I was also researching the people that made that video, and this is this is what they're up to now. And I don't want to get down on these guys, but there is something a little strange about it, I would say, and everybody needs their construction crew. But it does take the skills of the women who were once stitching together those caribou hides, and it changes the work site atmosphere, you might say, a little bit. It looks like the most average construction crew ever. And well, what do you think of this house? I'm not sure if those guys are building this house, but that's what they're building, or that's what they're doing. Right. No, I do want to be fair because people need houses, and I don't want to live in a fucking conical lodge. I want to live in a house. I don't want the lodge. But at the same time, I do think, I don't know if these are going to really be what we need in the circumpolar north. I don't know if this average construction crew building those kinds of things, hundreds of them, is really what we're gonna be needing. Now, I don't know if I want to live in this either. I was trying to look for examples of people who are building different kinds of things. So this was an Arctic village, also in the circumpolar north. That's the direction we need to go, like incorporating the natural world into our buildings. And I'm sure we have to go like this, but the idea is that we're going to have to come up with structures and places to live which work with the earth and work with the materials, and for getting our insulation and getting our resources and those kinds of things. Now, obviously, they are using the term architecture and the idea of indigenous architecture and cultural forms. So we'll just let it ride, because what they're trying to do here is to think about how we can take these, what we might call older forms, or older forms of knowledge and seeing, and put them together with more modern elements to make them. You know, you still have your telephone pole in the distance. You can still, or electricity, I'm sure what they're generating. So it can still have some wires there, but it can still be wired up, but get your insulation from the earth. So there you go.